Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, speaking of the global economy in March 2007, said it's as strong as I've seen it in my business career. Our financial institutions are strong, he added in March 2008. Our banks are strong. They're going to be strong for many, many years. Well, actually, they weren't strong for very much longer because the collapse was about to begin. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke echoed this sentiment. In May 2007, as the housing collapse began to hit our economy, Bernanke said, "We do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy or to the financial system." But things did spill over. By mid-March 2008, Wall Street investment bank Bear Stearns was collapsing. Rather than let it collapse, the Fed jumped in and bailed it out by lending money to investment bank JP Morgan with Bear Stearns' worthless mortgage-backed securities as collateral. The Federal Reserve, without any vote in Congress, simply bought Bear Stearns and handed it to JP Morgan. Why? The systemic risk that a Bear Stearns disappearance would allegedly cause. The strong economy was being treated very gingerly indeed. Now remember that the Fed is created by Congress, but Congress is the body within the United States government that has legislative powers. But the legislative powers only extend as far as what the Constitution allows them to have. Does it say anywhere in the Constitution that the legislature can create an entity, an agency within the government that can go out and buy up private companies and then hand them off to other companies? No, it doesn't. In August 2008, Paulson and Bernanke assured the country that other than perhaps another bailout, this one for Fannie and Freddie, the fundamentals of the economy were sound. Don't panic. Don't stop investing. Don't stop borrowing to buy homes. Spend like you're Paris Hilton. Everything is just fine. These guys sounded like Joe Isuzu, which is the guy that used to sell cars, and he was notorious for lying. You would think that anyone who fed the public such lines through the first 8 months of 2008 would have lost all credibility, and probably his job. But not only did Bernanke and Paulson retain their positions as the stock market melted down in September, but these men who were proven so wrong in their assessment of the situation also demanded unprecedented new powers to fix it. While everything had been just fine only moments before, by September radical measures were suddenly necessary to stave off a financial calamity of historic proportions. On September 7th, Secretary Paulson announced that the U.S. government would take over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the institutions that have been packaging 75% of all American mortgage loans. So they were no longer just going to be GSEs, they were going to be owned by the American government. Fannie and Freddie held $5 trillion in mortgage liabilities. Think about that, $5 trillion. That was, at that time, probably about a third of the entire American economy for a year, the GDP of the United States. That's a lot of money. And no one knew what fraction of that sum was in danger of default. The arrangement was called conservatorship, but everyone knew it was simple nationalization, the direct government takeover of a private or quasi-private, as in this case, institution. Just like that, the Secretary of the Treasury had taken over most of the American mortgage market. Neither Congress nor anyone else was consulted. Paulson suggested that taxpayers might actually gain from the transaction, since the federal government placed itself ahead of the common shareholders to receive whatever profits these giants might post in the future. So whenever companies sell stock, they often do so with what's called preferred stock and common stock. I don't know tons and tons about it, but what the government would have done here was place themselves behind the preferred stockholders and in front of the common stockholders in terms of who's going to get their money first from that company. More likely are at least hundreds of billions in losses to be picked up by the taxpayer. The New York Times lived up to its normal level of sycophancy, calling this taxpayer guarantee of dubious assets a reasonable and reassuring move. By November, Fannie was reporting a $29 billion, again, $29 billion third quarter loss and warning that by the end of the year, its net worth could be negative. So in just 3 months, they lost $29 billion. Things began unraveling quickly. The following week, the Fed orchestrated Bank of America's purchase of Merrill Lynch. Shortly beforehand, Paulson had lined up 10 financial institutions to work out a bailout for Lehman Brothers. Merrill Lynch was one of those 10. So Merrill Lynch is lined up, or basically recruited by the American government, to step in and buy out Lehman Brothers. But Merrill Lynch was in such a bad financial position that just a few days later, they were going to have to be sold off to Bank of America. So what do you think is going to happen to Lehman Brothers at this point? Lehman Brothers is gone. Paulson was so out of the loop, wrote one observer, that he did not realize that not only could Merrill Lynch not come up with $7 billion as its share of the proposed bailout of Lehman, it would cease to exist as a separate institution before the day was over. Lehman Brothers was ultimately allowed to go bankrupt. Paulson explained at the time that there would be no wave of bailouts. He did not want to encourage moral hazard. Moral hazard is the increased likelihood of risky behavior when the acting party believes that any cost of his behavior will be borne not by himself alone, but by a large pool of people. As when a firm behaves recklessly because it expects to be bailed out with other people's resources. Moral hazard is something I don't take lightly, he said. The next day, an $85 billion bailout of insurance giant AIG was announced. Okay, so you need a little bit of background on who AIG is. AIG is an insurance company. It's American Insurance Group or something along those lines. So AIG would have been insuring a lot of these securities, the mortgage-backed securities. And so if somebody takes a loss on the mortgage-backed security, if they have a policy with AIG, then AIG is going to pay out on that policy. So it's kind of like you buy insurance for your car. If you get into a wreck and your car is totaled, then you don't have to pay for the car on your own. You've been paying the insurance company all these years, and they're going to step in and they're going to cut you a check for the car. Same thing with AIG. But the losses were so tremendous in the mortgage-backed securities market and the mortgage market that AIG itself was going to go out of business because of all of the insurance policies it was going to have to pay out on. AIG found itself in trouble not so much because it was heavily invested in mortgage-backed securities, but because it had issued so many credit default swaps on them. In effect, insurance policies against defaults. The consequences of the bursting housing bubble for mortgage-backed securities were grim. With housing values going down, interest rates going up on adjustable rate mortgages, and more people either upside down in their mortgages, owing more than their houses were worth, or about to be hit with dramatically higher monthly payments, foreclosures were inevitable. The securities into which these mortgages had been bundled soon tumbled in value. Their plummeting values, in turn, amounted to a crisis for AIG. I'm going to go back to a term that Woods used here. It's called upside down on your mortgage. And he describes it as when you owe more than your house is worth. So you still owe $100,000 on your house, but your house is only worth $90,000, you're upside down $10,000. This is also called being underwater on a mortgage. The Fed's bailout of AIG was, in the words of the New York Times, the most radical intervention in private business in the central bank's history. The Fed would lend AIG $85 billion in exchange for 80% of the company. Congress, as usual, was not consulted. Meanwhile, social studies teachers across the country continued to report for work to detail how a bill becomes a law, how the will of the people is the guiding principle of the U.S. government, and how the public good motivates their government officials. By November, AIG needed another $40 billion. Washington had become a beggar's alley for corporations, and taxpayers had become milk cows.